This is my first time at Chapel Hill. I'm honored to be here. If I may say a word in particular favor of your trees, I've been around Duke and I've not been very impressed by the vegetation around there. It's rather scruffy, tertiary growth, very boring. But you have some magnificent trees around here, and I've actually seen students, which is very unusual on campuses these days. You see Irvine, it's just depleted. It's like a neutron bomb has gone off, and they're not reading their phones. So it looks to me like a very lovely, lovely place to be. And I hope I get an opportunity to come back at greater length in the future. Let me state some core principles. Every student enrolled in this university is among the most privileged individuals in human history. And I use the term privilege in a positive sense. Why? Because you have at your fingertips the thing that Faust sold his soul for, knowledge. To be sure, some not in the tech building. Life science people, I guess, aren't so great with the recording technology.
Sorry about that.
Okay, is that better? Sounds the same to me, but okay, we'll proceed. You are surrounded by libraries that would have driven the Renaissance humanists wild with envy and desire. You can read every book that has ever been written. You have access to cutting-edge science laboratories, except for with regards to audio-visual. And they're all open to you as long as you put in the effort to learn. You can explore one of the most dramatic of all human developments, the evolution of style. How did literary expression, for example, evolve from medieval allegory to the 19th century realist novel with its acute investigations of individual consciousness? Why did the cool symmetries of the Parthenon give way to the wild upthrustings of Notre Dame Cathedral, only to be supplanted by the ecstatic flamboyance of the Baroque? What connects the majestic resplendence of a Mozart symphony to the coruscating ironies of a Mahler symphony? These are urgent questions whose pursuit will bring you closer to an understanding of the range of human experience. And yet, students at campuses across the country are all too often being taught to regard the opportunity for knowledge as a source of oppression and to see bigotry where none exists. Where are students getting these views? From a pervasive ideology that has taken over university bureaucracies and many of the disciplines. That ideology holds that the most important thing about a person is his race and sex, and that discrimination based on those characteristics is the defining feature of American colleges in particular, and American society in general. Students routinely announce their victimhood before an appreciative audience of diversity deanlets and vice provosts who use the occasion to expand their bureaucratic domain. Any student, however, who thinks of himself as oppressed on a college campus is in the grips of a terrible delusion that will encumber him for the rest of his life. The reality is this: there has never been an environment more tolerant towards history's traditionally marginalized groups than an American campus. Traits that can still lead to death and warfare in other countries are actively celebrated in academia. UNC, like colleges everywhere, is filled with liberal, well-meaning faculty who want all their students to succeed. They are not bigots. They are paragons of goodwill. Every faculty hiring search is one concerted effort to find even remotely qualified minority and female candidates who have not been snapped up already by other colleges. So fervently do campus administrators across the country desire the presence of so-called students of color, that for 5 decades, they have almost universally employed vast racial preferences in admissions. Whether they will stop doing so in the wake of the Supreme Court's recent ban on race-based admissions remains to be seen. UNC's trustees are to be commended for their promise to abide by the court's decision. Even with the best of intentions, however, extirpating academia's all-consuming focus on racial identity is going to be a long slog. Listen to how the student witnesses for the defense in the anti-preferences lawsuit described their applications to UNC and to Harvard. A Black UNC alumna testified that it was, quote, really important that UNC saw how the, quote, texture of her hair had impacted her upbringing. Really? Are we now that desperate for race-based markers of oppression? Why not describe the books that seduced you with the beauty of their language, or the scientific discoveries that inflamed your curiosity about the natural world? A Black Harvard alumna complained that, quote, to try to not see her race is to try to not see her, simply because there is no part of her experience, no part of her journey, no part of her life that has been untouched by her race. The question arises, do we as a society want to be colorblind or not? The answer from so-called progressives is an unequivocal no, even though they also claim that race is not real. Such self-involvement has been taught these students by the entire educational industry. Compare their identity-based solipsism to the West's humanist tradition. That tradition was founded on the all-consuming desire to engage with real difference, the difference of the past. The 14th century Florentine poet Francesco Petrarch triggered the explosion of knowledge known today as Renaissance humanism with his discovery of Livy's monumental history of Rome and the letters of Cicero. But Petrarch didn't want to just read the ancients. He wanted to converse with them as well. So he penned heartfelt letters in Latin to Virgil, Seneca, Horace, and Homer, among others, informing them of the fate of their writings and of Rome itself. After rebuking Cicero for the vindictiveness revealed in his letters, Petrarch repented and wrote him again, quote, I fear that my last letter has offended you, but I feel I know you as intimately as if I had always lived with you. The burning drive to recover a lost culture propelled the Renaissance humanists into remote castles and monasteries across Europe to search for long-forgotten manuscripts. The knowledge that many ancient texts were forever lost filled these scholars with despair. Nevertheless, they exulted in their growing repossession of classical learning, for which they felt, in Ralph Waldo Emerson's words, a canine appetite. In Francois Rabelais' exuberant Gargantua stories from the 1530s, the giant Gargantua sends off his son to study in Paris, joyfully conjuring up the languages, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Chaldean, and Arabic, that he expects him to master, as well as the vast range of history, law, natural history, and philosophy. In short, he concludes, let me find you a perfect abyss of knowledge. Why did that humanist tradition, with its passion for learning, get supplanted by the belief that the fight against alleged racism is the most important part of a college's mission? How can it be that students are encouraged to reject books based on the skin color and sex of those books' authors? The causes are many, but one in particular stands out. Starting in the 1960s, many colleges, in penance for America's deplorable racial history, began admitting Black students with academic skill levels far below those of their non-preferred peers. Predictably, those alleged beneficiaries of racial preferences struggled in their classes. Had those students instead matriculated at a college where they shared the same level of preparation as their peers, they would have succeeded at rates comparable to their peers. Universities refused to acknowledge the results of this academic mismatch. A few years ago, a retention task force at UNC was convened to address the low graduation rate of underrepresented minorities. The task force found that students' graduation rates were correlated to their academic preparation when they entered as freshmen. Those students admitted with large academic preferences were the least likely to graduate. This finding was, again, totally predictable. The average Black admit to UNC had a combined SAT score 200 points below those of the average Asian admit on a 1,600-point scale. An out-of-state Asian male applicant with a 25% chance of admission would see his odds rise to 99% were he Black. Rather than rethink UNC's racial preferences, however, the task force recommended even larger preferences to create a critical mass of Black students. UNC was hardly alone in this counterproductive response. Every other university has done the same. We can debate the cause of these academic disparities and how best to address them. But given their existence, you can have diversity or you can have meritocracy. You cannot have both. Colleges opted for diversity. And in so doing, they set in motion the suppression of free thought that bedevils universities today. The prime target of that suppression is discourse around race. It became taboo to acknowledge the skills gap. And therefore, it was imperative to come up with an alternative explanation for why Black students admitted on diversity grounds were falling behind. Universities adopted a big lie, that they were systemically racist. Never mind that the very reason for academic mismatch was that universities were so desperate to get their numbers of Black students up, even if doing so imposed a terrible handicap on those students. Anyone who challenges that big lie will be a pariah at best and a pink slip recipient at worst. To buttress the taboo around open discourse, campus ideologues came up with the hilarious conceit that college students are at mortal risk from ideas that they dislike, and that so-called hate speech, defined as ideas that challenge campus orthodoxies, is not constitutionally protected. On virtually every American campus, a vast bureaucracy rose up to institutionalize the big lie of systemic racism. The DEI bureaucracy was premised on the idea that Black students were so under assault from racist faculty, administrators, and students that they needed official allies to protect them. UNC's Office for Diversity and Inclusion declares that it, quote, aspires to have all community members feel respected, valued, and visible. Without the DEI bureaucrats, 14 at last count in the central office alone, we are to believe that minority students would be disrespected, devalued, and invisible. Leave aside for a moment whether any student should expect to feel respected, valued, and visible. I am confident that no adult at UNC is disrespecting minority students. To the contrary, I am confident that UNC's faculty and staff want minority students above all else to succeed. The same is true on every American campus. College presidents, however, such as Princeton's Christopher Eisgruber or Yale's Peter Salovey, prefer to announce that they preside over a racist institution than to proclaim the truth of equal opportunity. The DEI bureaucracy relentlessly amplifies their false message of exclusion and disrespect. But what about this idea that students are entitled to feel, quote, respected, valued, and visible? Here's an alternative. Students should approach their college experience with fear and trembling. Are they worthy of these great books? Can their feeble understanding possibly do justice to the masterworks of the past? College is not about therapy or self-esteem. It is about filling students' empty noggins with as much knowledge of their civilizational inheritance as is possible in a mere 4 years. A course catalog should fill them with awe, desire, and self-doubt. Students earn the right to feel respected, valued, and visible by mastering a field with as much joy and determination as the Renaissance humanists. Until then, humility is in order. The attack on meritocracy has leapt from campuses to the world at large, most disturbingly in the STEM fields. Scientific journals proclaim that science and medicine are racist. Medical licensing boards are eliminating meritocratic standards that have a disparate impact on Blacks. Medical schools admit, hire, and promote on the basis of race. The federal government doles out research grants in neurology and oncology on the basis of race and sets the research agenda according to which fields have the most Black participants. That means moving funding away from basic science and into research on racial disparities in health. This preference for race over merit will encumber future medical progress and put lives at risk. It is imperative, therefore, that colleges lead the way back to colorblind standards of excellence. They should admit students and hire faculty based on their academic skills. Everything else is a distraction. Ideally, college admissions officers should be given pink slips and replaced with an objective process of selection. These self-important functionaries fancy themselves artistes, crafting little utopian communities. Harvard asks its desperate 16-year-old supplicants, quote, "What about your maturity, character, leadership, self-confidence, warmth of personality, sense of humor, energy, concern for others, and grace under pressure?" Oh man, what admissions officer could pass such tests, much less an inchoate adolescent? A UNC admissions officer quoted in the anti-preferences lawsuit recommended, quote, "If it's brown and above a 1300 SAT, put them in for the merit scholarship." Another UNC gatekeeper explained her decision to admit an applicant with an extremely low ACT score as a way to, quote, "give these brown babies a shot at these merit dollars." We have conferred on these obscure officials the power to determine the trajectory of American childhood with its desperate efforts to accumulate phony resume files that might spark the interest of a applications reader. Now, the chopping block should be every diversity, equity, and bureaucrat. There is no substantive knowledge or expertise in the DEI role. They are phony positions intended merely to signal that a college takes anti-racism mission seriously. But that mission, as previously noted, is based on a lie. To the extent that underrepresented minority students feel place, it is only because they were admitted to the now illegal regime of racial preferences and were catapulted cruelly into college for which they were academically mismatched. Indeed, the majority of student services bureaucracy is equally superfluous. It is vast but hollow efforts whose retention specialists and belonging coordinators exist only because of the effect of racial preferences. Their only accomplishment has been to drive up the cost of tuition to obscene levels. They too should get the act. In the nationwide outpouring report on college campuses for the attacks on Israel, DEI officials at schools were the first out of the gate to assert equivalence between Hamas and Israel. That is coincidence. The spread of intersectional action against Israel is a problem anti-Western ideology that dominates academia and that is nurtured by diverse Democrats. A warning: colleges do comply with the Supreme Court decision, and I hope UNC can be one of them. Face the following dilemma. These schools exploit the admission loophole provided by Justice John to continue rewarding certain racial identities. If non-consensus is widespread, schools forswear preferences will see their Black population drop. Those students who would have been on their merit will have been by less colleges. And compliance will inevitably be of being racially exclusionary, even immaculate colorblind. They're little that the minority students who will the same chance of ending up of their class as everyone else. Law-abiding schools must be prepared to defend practices, explain that academic gap bias that impedes so-called racial diversity. Never blind themselves to the violation of a founding idea with slavery segregation, violation, mockery of America's commitment to diversity. It is a trap of opportunity to read the past only lens of opening one's vast tradition, whose accomplishments outweigh it, was contemptible, and whose are exceeded every other present. Ignorant intellectual that led to law, the West's imaginable put achievements at risk. Learning is an end in itself. It's really better to one's narrow self, minds, subtle and zone. Done. Philosopher said as many as are his knowledge. Add many different by his literature, music, the humanities, forms of how us to things but otherwise experience. Society, century state or crystalline and shades of poetry or the anger of a nocturne. These just years to listen beauty, complex, tragic grandeur. For counter his mind, grappling minds down on gratitude for the been bequeathed. Get the most great if tribalism, politics, and free individuals among and ex. Thank you. I look forward.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Okay, that was great. Thank you very much. You want to test it?
Yep. Testing.
You want to try this one?
I can hold it.
Okay.
Testing.
What? Okay. We can talk up.
Okay, great. So assuming racial preferences and admissions are completely removed, what challenges, you talked a little bit about it, what challenges do you foresee in implementing and enforcing these changes, and how do you think those should be addressed?
Well, the challenges are going to be ideological, where if you see at UNC a drop, as I say, in your Black population, you're going to come under enormous pressure. And you're going to have to break the taboo that explains why a colorblind meritocratic admission system is not going to produce a racially proportional student body. But over time, with higher expectations, without the incessant lowering of standards that tells students that they should not strive to achieve at their very best, I think those disparities will go away and attention will be directed to the right place, which is earlier in education. I mean, let me just break some taboos here and speak very frankly and give you a sense of what we're talking about as far as these skills gaps. This is why you can have at present meritocracy or proportional diversity. You can't one or the other, you can't have both. The College Board calculates so-called benchmark scores, which on the two parts of the SATs, which give a student a 75% chance in his freshman year of getting a C+ or more in his freshman year classes. And the benchmark scores in North Carolina are very low. On an 800-point scale in reading, all you need to do to get a benchmark score that gives you the 75% chance is a 480 on an 800-point scale. And in math, the benchmark score is 530. Well, in North Carolina, 40% of Black 12th graders get benchmarks in neither math or reading. They do not even meet the 480 and the 530, compared to 6% of Asian American students who do not meet either benchmark and 9% of white North Carolinas. That's a problem, but it's not the problem that the university can solve. As far as how I would say, again, ideally, I would go to a pure objective test of admissions, of merit, standardized scores, because with those in place, the Board of Trustees will be able to tell whether UNC's administration is trying to weasel its way around the Supreme Court decision by having a record of the group averages that it's admitting students on.
Okay, just to follow up on that a little bit, if we do judge merit solely by standardized testing, how do you propose, if at all, universities assess qualities like resilience, leadership, community involvement? Does that play a role, do you think, or is that really just fluff?
I find we've lost it again. It's okay. Should I just speak up? I find those judgments preposterous and condescending. I don't think that, I mean, maybe resilience, overcoming hardship, but I just think those are intangibles that no admissions officer has the capacity to evaluate. These are based on college essays. Give me a break. I mean, how many tens of thousands of applications does UNC entail? Even if there were one-on-one interviews with each applicant to UNC, which is an impossibility, how is a college admissions officer to judge resilience and character in what, a 30-minute interview? It's impossible. I think that the only thing that we've got that is fair, that does not entail capriciously idiosyncratic judgments on the part of these admissions officers, is an objective test that measures everybody according to the same scale. And I am certain that within that scale, there is a distribution of resilience and character and honesty that is sufficient to create an interesting class.
Okay, thank you. What's your viewpoint on gender diversity? Because we know that university students are average in terms of attendees at college, average about 60% female, 40% male, which creates a lot of issues, not just on campus, but beyond, right? As people look for, potential mates. Should universities try to improve the percent of males attending? And if so, how?
No, I'm against all preferences, and it should not be in the other direction either. I mean, if let's say MIT wanted to admit me for its gender equity, and I had 600 on my math SATs and everybody else had 800s, I'm going to flail. So the problem of mismatch is not race specific. It's about preferences. Let me just get that out there. But as far as gender, I find it depressing that males are falling behind. It is not surprising given the massive anti-male bias in our culture today and the fact that the only sex that's getting explicit encouragement from elite institutions is females. You know, if you want to get a coding fellowship, you know, you got to be girls who code. Rockefeller, Ford Foundation, McConnell, they're all sending messages to girls that you are the ones we care about. If you to be a male today is to try and claw your way up without explicit encouragement. In fact, to be constantly told that your sex is toxic, as the American Psychology Association declared several years ago, simply by virtue of, on average, being more inclined to be competitive, to take risks, to, you know, aspire to things that are possibly crazy. You know, this is why males get themselves killed in car accidents at higher rates. Serves them right as far as I'm concerned. But nevertheless, they did give us civilization. And the feminization of the university is, I think, a very, very worrisome trend. But the solution is not to bring in males who are not competitively qualified with the females. The solution is to change the narrative that tells males that they are the least of anybody's interest and concern.
If I could just follow up, you mentioned the feminization of the university. What could you expand on that a little bit?
In the Ivy League, 75% of all Ivy League presidents are female now. The vast majority of the college bureaucracy, at least 2/3, if not more on many campuses, is female. In various departments, it's fast tipping, and the student body is female. So colleges are becoming predominantly, especially in the bureaucracy, and of course, especially in the DEI bureaucracy, are becoming vast majority female.
But how does that impact what's happening on campus? Is there something inherently different?
For decades and decades, psychology had established what it called the big five personality traits. And these have been replicated again and validated again and again. And one of the traits, and this is what got the poor innocent lamb James Damore fired from Google when he was trying to provide an alternative explanation to gender bias to explain why Google was not 50-50 male female in its computer science and nanotechnology departments. And he talked about the average distribution of skills, especially at the tail end of, but he talked above all else of average inclinations of males and females. And he's talking about averages here. I'm sure that all of you UNC alums understand the concept of distribution, that an average doesn't tell you anything about any individual within a group, and that distributions vary in their tails. On the big five personality traits, one of those five is neuroticism. And Damore mentioned that females way, way outscore on the trait of neuroticism compared to males. What is neuroticism? Risk aversion, anxiety, lack of competitive drive. And I would say in general that there are average differences between the psychological predispositions of males and females. I would say that our COVID policies in this country were an embodiment of a feminine approach to cost benefit analysis, a zero sum, of a zero risk predilection, and an inability to measure the likely benefits from a policy against a likely cost. And to me, when you have a institution that is dominated by females, it will show different traits. We may like those traits. We may like a less focus on bottom line, ruthless cost benefit analysis, but it will change the character of an institution. And my God, early feminism was all about that. The feminists proclaimed that the reason to have more female leaders in political positions was they're going to be less bellicose. It's going to change the character of an institution. But of course, anybody playing an identity card wants it both ways. So feminists, on the one hand, want to both assert superiority on certain moral traits, and at the same time say that, don't you ever say that there's any difference between males and females. Well, actually, there are.
Okay. Yeah, I know some of the research shows that when you look at the preference for safe spaces versus free speech, there's a gender imbalance there.
Huge. Can I just say, Mark, that's absolutely right. Huge. I mean, 2/3 of females, the drive for safe space and a lack of interest in academic freedom and speech over safety, whatever that means, is very, very female centric.
Okay. So the events in the Middle East, you kind of mentioned a little bit, they've been roiling campuses around the United States. What should university leaders do about what's happening on campus?
Well, ideally, they would have embraced the Calvin principles before this began and would not have been previously putting out statements of political correctness, taking very strong institutional positions on various public events. But obviously, most campuses did not abide by the Calvin principles. We saw after the George Floyd death, virtually every college president immediately rushed out to declare Floyd's death emblematic of America's systemic white supremacy, that the police were systemically racist, and that their university was systemically racist, and they were going to embark on another, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of anti-racism training. They've taken similar stances after Dobbs, and maybe this is arguably more justified because they would say it bears on our institutional operations. They certainly all denounced the SFFA v. Harvard. So when many of them after the October 7th attacks, many of them were silent or came out with statements of institutional neutrality. A lot of people were scratching their heads and saying, well, wait a minute, why are you neutral now when before you assumed that to position George Floyd's death as the very emblem of America's, as President Joe Biden would say, the enduring stain on our soul of ineradicable white supremacy, you assumed that that was so non-controversial that you could make a statement, whereas apparently you feel that to condemn the terror attacks unequivocally is controversial and would alienate some part of your constituency. That's a curious position to be in. So those people who've been pushing the presidents for ever more explicit condemnations of Hamas, I understand where they're coming from. I think at this point, they nevertheless should be trying retroactively to reinstate some sort of institutional neutrality policy, but at the same time, they should be looking very hard at how they got in this position. These demonstrations are simply stunning. And if there was ever a moment that it's like taking iodine before you've had a CAT scan or an MRI that illuminates, what the circulatory system is in your body. This moment has shown us what the intersectional coalition means. To have thousands of students chanting pro-Hamas chants And they're all part of the DEI intersectional coalition that would rather take a stance against life and democracy. And when you have absurdities like Queers for Palestine, I mean, that is a literal absurdity. Go try holding a pride march in Gaza, or any place under the control of the PLO or Hamas, and see how far you get. And yet these students, the Queers for Palestine, are so blind, they are so ignorant of the realities on the ground. All they know is that Israel has been put into the category of white oppressor. And therefore, they are going to join up with groups who, again, in their native lands, would not give them the moments, they would be thrown off of roofs. Good luck with late-term abortions. Good luck with reproductive rights in these Islamic countries. But what unites these groups is not consistency of ideology in any factual, empirical sense. What unites these groups is hatred for a civilization deemed too white and too male. Yes, there's also longstanding anti-Semitism. But what's going on now is something much broader than that. And I hope that the donors in revolt are not going to frame this exclusively as an anti-Semitism problem, because it's not. Yes, anti-Semitism is millennia old, and it is playing a role, but it has been joined by a pathology that is more recent, which is a knee-jerk hatred for Western civilization itself. And that is what our universities are exporting into the world at large.
Okay, I'll ask one more question, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So if you're interested in asking a question, if you could come down to this row and just form a line, and we will start asking them as soon as I'm done with this one. So last question, given the ideological imbalance in universities, and the fact that, you can pass laws, right? We have the SCOTUS resolution, but how can people, and the fact that PhD students coming in are even further to the left in general, how can interested alumni, faculty, and students help turn the direction of universities around?
Oh, the most difficult question of all he saves for the end. It is a real conundrum, because, I do not have an answer. I'm just going to tell you that right now. I find it perverse, and with all due respect, my brilliant interlocutor, that faculty are one of the only professions in the world, in our country, that get to say, nobody gets to at all oversee what we say. You've got to funnel us money, taxpayers, give us all the money we want, and you may not have any role in what we teach and have any input in what our curriculum is going to be. Now, I understand the reason for that prickly independence, because we don't want we all can imagine the abuses on the other side, what gave rise to the American Association of University Presidents at Stanford in the turn of the 20th century, a conservative reaction against, the growing fields of social science and economics that was seen as anti-American. Even more recently, Harvard's trustees banning the use of Paul Samuelson's textbook on economics because it was seen as exporting communism. So, trustees can get it wrong, maybe, or maybe they were right. I don't know. Little did we know the slippery slope that we were putting in place. But they can get it wrong on both sides. Nevertheless, to me, it is not patently absurd that taxpayers or trustees can't say, could you please give some courses in American history and the Constitution that aren't exclusively about the hermeneutics of suspicion, that aren't exclusively about deconstructing the West, when you insist on teaching African history and Chinese history with immaculate respect and taking civilizations at face value rather than always trying to find the colonialist subtext. Why shouldn't you be able to have some input? But it is very difficult. At the very least, demand more transparency. You have a right to know what the syllabus is, what students are being taught. Just read the course descriptions. They adumbrate to 100% degree what is being chanted in these pro-Hamas rallies. The entire ethnic studies establishment infrastructure in this country is just one tortured academic prose about settler colonialism and all subalternity. And God, I mean, I go back to my 1970s days of absorbing high theory. It's a self-enclosed discourse that has very little empirical input. So keep yourselves informed and do not give your alma mater another cent unless you are convinced that it is willing and able to tell students why they should be down on their knees in gratitude to be a product of Western civilization.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. Love the Paul Ricoeur reference. I was just wondering if you could tell a little bit of a causal story about the change in universities and the build-up of bureaucracies. Is this just sort of like?
Yes, I'm not.
Oh, sorry. I was just wondering if you could tell a little bit more about the causal story about the change in universities and the buildup of bureaucracies. Is it just sort of like cultural shifts, or are you maybe sympathetic to someone like Christopher Caldwell, who says there's these legal mechanisms? And relatedly, I was wondering about the homogeneity, before the court case over the summer. Why weren't there any maverick institutions that that put away affirmative action? Why was this sort of a universalized institution?
Did you hear that?
Yeah. So he was basically saying, well, the last part was, how do we end up so homogenized as an institution? You want to hit the first part just really short?
Oh, I was just a causal story of
oh yeah, the causal story for what, what's really causing all this? Is it laws, or is it the
what's really causing it, I think, is the ongoing racial disparities in our institutions and the academic skills gap. And we're very uncomfortable that this many decades after the Civil Rights Acts, which were way a century too late, and America continued to treat Blacks with heartbreaking, gratuitous cruelty for way too long, but that we are not really shrinking those gaps. And that's very disturbing to many people. And so we are proleptically saying that the only allowable explanation for these ongoing racial disparities is racism. We're not allowed to talk about culture, and we're terrified of any hint of heritability. But culture, in the 1990s, you had social scientists like Orlando Patterson or Elijah Anderson who were allowed to talk about the inner city pathologies, like the old anti-acting white ethic that makes it impossible for those thousands of students in inner city neighborhoods who want to succeed. They have to go up against that anti-acting white ethic and buck peer pressure. And that's very tragic. And he could talk about that. We could talk about the breakdown of the family. We listened to rap music and we heard a culture that glorified misogyny, violence, homophobia, cop killing. We can't talk about any of that now. And so now the only allowable explanation is racism. It allows us to turn our eyes away from very disturbing realities, which is the crime rate in the inner city. Every single day, there are dozens of Blacks fatally mowed down in drive-by shootings. Every single day, that is more than all white and Hispanic homicide victims combined, even though blacks are 13% of the population. We turn our eyes away and we won't even talk about them. And no Black Lives Matter activist has ever said their names because they're killed by other blacks. So the homogeneity of this is because of the contagion of academic ideology, and it becomes a self-perpetuating, self-aggrandizing ideological sort of conformity. I once saw somebody do a PowerPoint slide. It was active, that showed with like a grid of maybe 100 slots. I can't remember exactly how it worked, but you start with one particular trend of ideology and whatnot, and you put a sort of an algorithm in place, and the entire institution very quickly becomes 100% of that particular slant. And that's what's going on in universities. And it is going to be very hard to turn them away, change them. And but starting new ones has its own problems. There's a recalcitrant group at the University of Pennsylvania that want to throw out the president and the chairman of the board of trustees there and introduce a new constitution to Penn that would embrace the Chicago principles, the Calvin principles, and say merit, not race, is our exclusive criterion for academic excellence. And they would refound the university on those principles, and the next president would have to sign on to them. That is a brilliant strategy. Now they've got to get rid of the president and the chairman of the board. Whether that happens, I don't know. But next question. Thank you.
Thank you.
You signed my book at the ABA a couple years ago. Thank you. I saw you in a debate with the ACLU head about 10 years ago. You were talking about who got stopped by police and why. You were brilliant in giving facts and figures and showing why there was no racism involved. It was just based on the numbers and who was violating, the rules of the road. The ACLU guy gave all personal anecdotes.
Is there a question in there?
Yes. So my question is, why does the left continue to ignore facts?
Well, they would say we do too. I mean, I'm not going to, I know the conservatives, I hear this a lot from, well, they have double standards and whatnot. They would accuse us of ignoring the facts of global warming, or ignoring the facts about, masks work or lockdowns work, or making up facts about rigged elections. There, I'm a little bit more sympathetic to the left, I have to say. So both sides have their epistemological and cognitive errors. Let's just face it. We all have extreme amounts of confirmation bias, and I am haunted with everything I write to try and hear how what I'm saying is heard by the left, and try and anticipate. I admit I don't do a very good job of it because I sometimes get sort of frustrated, but so with that having been said, that they think that we presumably ignore common sense, like the conservatives also love, we're for common sense and they're not. Well, I'll believe that if I ever hear the left say we're against common sense. Presumably the left thinks they've got common sense on their side too, but if they don't, then that's an interesting distinction. But with regards to a certain set of facts, and I'll also say this, I grew up on deconstruction. I grew up a postmodernist. I grew up a post-structuralist, thanks to my college education. And I'm still enough of one that in theory, I don't believe in truth. In theory, I do believe that truth is constructed, except when I write. When I write, I know I've got the facts and what I'm writing is true. So again, more confirmation bias. So I would say that, yes, when it comes to policing and crime, I would say there are obvious facts. The bodies do not lie. The bodies that show that blacks between the ages of 10 and 24 die of gun and homicide at 24 times the rate of whites in that same age cohort. The homicide data is the gold standard of all crime data. You can't hide the white bodies. These disparities are real. Since George Floyd, Black juveniles are shot at 100 times the rate of white juveniles. We're not hiding white shooting victims, so those facts are real. They will not acknowledge them because they contradict their favored narrative, which is that the main threat to Black people today is white supremacists. And again, I'm sorry to be partisan, but with all due respect to our president, he harps on that reality constantly, and it is an explicit and overt falsehood. You could throw out every white on Black shooting and it would have zero effect on the Black death by homicide rate. You want to talk about interracial violence and white supremacy? When you look at all interracial violence between Blacks and whites and Blacks, Blacks commit 87% of all interracial violence between Blacks and whites and Blacks. A Black person is 35 times more likely to commit an act of violence against a white person than a white person is against a Black person. And yet, Joe Biden and the entire mainstream media insist that it is white supremacists who threaten Black lives. And in fact, we had the mayor of Kansas City earlier this year saying existing while Black is now dangerous because of white people. That is a lie.
Heather, could you bless the audience with your explanation about why societies that have used standardized tests only in the past historically have been successful societies?
Did you say why societies that use standardized tests have successful societies?
In the past.
In the past,
Past?
correct.
Do you have an example? You mean like Singapore or?
Well, I mean, they still are. I mean, I think we've got the Asian societies that are catching up fast. I mean, they are whooping our ass when it comes to technical skills. And I don't think that people at the higher levels of certain types of cognitive skills are deficient in other traits. Like this idea that if you select based on an objective test that gets rid of the human discretion and subjectivity, and let's not forget, as Nicholas Lehman wrote, the whole purpose of the SATs was to get rid of bias. You know, schools were discriminating against Jews. They were discriminating against females. We went to standardized tests to cut out the sort of white shoe WASP prejudices and that would allow universities to find talent from people that didn't graduate from Groton and Andover and Exeter. So the idea that selecting on the basis of objective tests of merit, and let me also say this, we also hear that, oh, objective tests, SATs are non-predictive. Not true. There is no more left-wing faculty group than the faculty of the University of California. Their faculty study Senate did a study in 2019 saying, should we get rid of the SAT? Should we make it either optional or ban it altogether? The University of California Faculty Senate found that there was nothing that better predicted academic success than the SATs. It did a much better job than GPA, high school GPA. And of course, the regents ignored them and banned the submission of the SAT. But the idea that selecting on that ground is going to mean that you've got like some terribly uninteresting group of people, I just don't buy it. Last time I checked, Asians and Jews, which let's be honest, dominate at the high end of these cognitive tests. They all play 2 or 3 instruments. They've given us some of the greatest chess players and musicians and writers and Nobelists. I don't believe that these are a particularly dull group of people. So that's my answer.
And Oxford, right? Oxford was the first university to start this whole trend.
I-
They did well.
Yeah.
And Oxford, it's okay.
You hold the mic a little closer to them. Slowly,
Good,
please.
finally.
You talked earlier in your opening remarks about sort of this erosion of merit in the wider society, and there are examples such as Oregon eliminating math and literacy standards. And I know the local school district last year gave a directive to lessen the percentage of disciplinary referrals for
Yes.
Black females. And it's sort of met with indifference. So my question is just, how do you make people care about all of that and sort of change it on a wider, you talked at the end about changing it within a university, but in a wider society, how do you make people stand up against that sort of ridiculousness?
I'm really sorry. I'm hard of hearing.
So how do you get, so we've had schools, mostly K through 12, like reduce standards
Yeah.
or get rid of subjects. And, how do you get people in the wider society to care about that stuff?
That is so true. I mean, I've been doing podcasts on my book, and one of the questions I get is, why should people care about merit? And I find that just an amazing question that I have to articulate, but you're absolutely right. It needs to be articulated. I don't know, like, do you care when you're taken into an emergency room because you've just been in a near fatal car crash, whether the doctor who walks through that door has been chosen and got through medical school on the basis of skills and was licensed on the basis of skills, not on the basis of race or sex or sexual orientation, which is what we're moving towards. We've already gotten rid of the grades in the step 1 of the U.S. medical licensing exam because they have a disparate impact on Blacks. Step 2 is in the crosshairs. We're getting rid of MCATs. University of North Carolina has a program. It waives MCATs for groups in certain students in certain preferred groups. These things matter, and civilization depends on incentivizing and rewarding excellence. Civilization is not based on mediocrity. It's based on high standards and celebrating people who are above and beyond mediocrities like myself, that I have the capacity to see through the mysteries of science or to express the profundities and terrors and joys of human existence in a way that slobs like most of us can never do. And that is how civilizations have pulled themselves, and Western civilization pulled the rest of the world with it, with such extraordinary insights as the scientific method, randomized controlled experiments. There's nothing like that as an engine for prosperity and for liberating humans from squalor. And that's through a belief in excellence and merit. And tearing down standards. I mean, right now we are holding our most gifted and talented math students back. We are saying in California, you may not accelerate in the study of math and calculus and algebra 2 because there's not enough Black students in those advanced classes. So we're going to hold you back in the hope that Blacks and Hispanics catch up. It does not happen. And meanwhile, China is throwing everything it's got at its most talented math students. It's plucking them out, and it is killing these kids with competition, but it is making sure that they live up to their potential. And as I say, they are whooping our ass in the International Math Olympiad, in every other type of international math competition. And if you think this is not going to eventually tip the balance of power in China's favor, you're fooling yourselves.
Thinking back to the woman in the anecdote who wanted Harvard to consider her hair, she's likely a product of a culture and a system that has told her from a very young age that her hair is important and that diversity is the highest value a person can aspire to. And I think that's why my daughter tells me that at her middle school, 25 to 30% of the students identify as LGBT. How do we even begin to unring that bell?
Identity, these traits of identity are trivial. They are not what should define us. But yes, we have conferred on students now with the whole LGBTQ thing, which surely is the strangest thing in all of human history. I mean, I cannot begin to understand what's going on. I have my hypotheses, which we needn't go into tonight, but it is truly the weirdest thing that has ever happened in all of humanity. But it confers on adolescents the thing that every adolescent yearns for, which is power. Power over adults, to crush them under your thumb if they misgender you. And you can come up with ever new categories of sexual deviance, and you can keep the adults like struggling like hamsters on a wheel to try and catch up. And so, yes, we have told students that they should be defined based on not their accomplishments, not their ideas, but these things that are really to the side. And in certain respects, you know, it gives you an accomplishment. Like, I will say this, being female is not an accomplishment. I don't take any, you know, I do not deserve anything for being for being female. And the same is true for being gay. It is not an accomplishment. And the same is true for being Black. It is not an accomplishment. But by celebrating identity, we make these accomplishments. So nobody can take away from the fact that you're Black. This like gives you an accomplishment. Or being gay gives you an accomplishment, or being female gives you an accomplishment. You don't have to work at it, but it's a hustle. We have got to stop being susceptible to this hustle. And so we need to have more and more institutions that say, I don't give a damn about your gonads and your melanin. The only thing I care about is, can you write? Can you do math? Are you learning an instrument? Do you care about geography? What have you done to improve your mind and to make yourself a worthy recipient of this civilization?
We have 3 questions left, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, so I wanted to see what you thought about, because I think this is a significant part of the data you mentioned about their the lower performance on various metrics of.
You have to speak up, or I'm not gonna have to.
You get it closer to his mouth.
Closer?
Yeah.
Or could you guys move toward me more, maybe? No. Oh, is that gonna be? We're gonna have this problem. Okay. Sorry.
So I had a question about the what I think is a big part of the data you mentioned about how there's, you know, various measures of lower performance by minority students on different tests and whether they're successful in college. It's something I don't hear discussed a lot when people talk about being more inclusive of minorities, but it's something that happens well before the college admissions process, which is child malnourishment. The human brain is a complex thing. It needs to be properly nourished during childhood, and a lack of being well fed can permanently inhibit somebody's ability to have a fully functioning brain, and that is going to affect their ability to perform well in areas of higher learning. At that point, it's pretty much irreversible. You can't regrow your brain once you're an adult. It's putting a lot of the blame in various ways on admissions, on advisors, on professors, on teachers.
Well, when you say well-fed, so do you mean a proper balance of vitamins and minerals? Because certainly yes, there are kids growing up with crack mothers that are possibly not feeding them at all because they're so strung up. But the problem in America today is not lack of food, it's obesity. So a lot of young people in, in underrepresented groups, they have higher rates of obesity. So it's not calories that are deficient. I would say the problem is more other aspects of upbringing Obviously, the breakdown of the two-parent family is catastrophic. It is cataclysmic. Patrick Moynihan said that the civil rights progress was grind to a halt in 1965 because the out-of-wedlock birth rate in the Black community was so high, and too many Black boys were being raised without fathers in the home. At that point, what Daniel Patrick Moynihan thought was the end of civil rights progress, the out-of-wedlock birth rate for Black children was 23%. It is now 71% out-of-wedlock birth rate. So that was a problem. That is a problem. And the lack of fathers, the having two parents in the home, the mother and the father provides structure. It provides twice as many kin resources, twice as many inputs. Males and females are different on average in the interests and what they inspire their children to do. But there's also a need for more structure. Kids in many of these communities grew up without a sense of deferred gratification and of impulse control, and that's what's going on in these classrooms. So I think that there is culture shifts that need to happen. I'm not sure nutrition. I know that Steve Pinker has looked into the lead explanation for crime commission and has found that that doesn't hold out. The nutrition thing, I would say, would be the least of my concern, to be perfectly honest. I would say family structure and family norms are more important.
Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I definitely agree with your thoughts on needing to improve K through 12 education, particularly for boys. I do agree that the school system is sort of designed to favor women and women preferences right now. Can you hear me at all? Or
She's basically
Okay.
saying that schools are failing boys.
Oh, yeah.
yes, so I agree on that. One thing I'm not as sure about, though, is the fact that we have more women than men enrolling in colleges. I do see that as a big issue, and I've thought about what we could do to fix it. I think there's so much maturity that's gained by living away from home. And, you know, some of these trade schools that we have, it's like, could that be done at a college just so we could help the ratio, so that we could help men and women learn to interact with each other better. And I do think it also affects women's achievement. And I say that because I see so many girls going through this. And, you know, it's been for many years now where they have eating disorders. It's extremely, extremely common in high school. And a lot of that does relate to interaction with boys. I know women go through a ton of emotional abuse.
Is there a question in there?
Yes, there is a question in there. Sorry. But I just think that, you know, these are issues that women face, and I know men have their own issues, but I mean, it's just something that is so important to them that I think it has a grave effect on their level of achievement. And obviously, the decline in dating and marriage is having a grave effect on our society.
Is your question?
Well, okay, so here's what I heard. I think you were suggesting that we have like trade possibilities within college for males. I mean, I think, frankly, let's face it, we should cut our college student body population by 90%. We have this ridiculous idea, thanks to the, you know, white collar elites, that your life is over unless you've got a college degree. And even though at the tail end of the math skills distribution, males predominate to females 2 to 1, at the bottom end, males predominate. The math dummies, the absolute clues, are also males. But there's an inclination that males have that is a beautiful thing, to want to figure out machines, to work with your hands, to get things right. I don't know if anybody's, you know, young female wives at this point are ever going to have the joy of having a husband that knows how to fix electrical wiring anymore. But that was once a great thing, that they could figure out plumbing. And we now have disparaged. We don't even talk about the trades. That's ridiculous. Instead, we have with the entire society is about funneling more and more people into college. And now you have colleges that have yield management specialists there. It's this bizarrely capitalist institution that's all about getting the warm bodies in the first year class. Huge numbers drop out within the first 6 months, but they put in their deposit. And it's all about just pulling in more and more students who never should have been in college in the first place and would have been much better off learning a skill. And it's all based on this snobbery. And so instead we create these phony majors like marketing. Are you kidding me? You're going to college to learn marketing? You should be reading Aeschylus, you idiots. So first of all, much fewer colleges, and as far as females today, they are basket cases. It's unbelievable. Yes, we went through the anorexia, we went through the cutting, and yet they're still dominant. It's a very weird thing. And the trans phenomenon is highly female. And it's obviously a social contagion. You know, 20 years ago, there was no such thing as a trans person. And now, as you say, 30% are trans. Clearly, this is a source of neuroses, or an outcome of neuroses, and an effort at becoming visible and powerful. So I would say maybe if society focused a little less on females, stop talk about trauma, stop celebrating victimhood, and be a little more balanced in our attention to males and females, maybe things would work out. But right now, I mean, I've written about the hookup culture on campus. It is absolutely pathological for both males and females. Females are trying desperately to mimic males in their innate promiscuity, and males' innate voracious and uncivilized and grotesque sex drive, and females can't keep up. And so instead they're all declaring themselves rape victims, which is equally false. So anyway, it's a complicated story.
Okay, so one thing before the last question for the students, there's the Chick-fil-A is out the door and to the right. So.
That's why you came. Now I know.
Based on polls and referendums, it seems like most Americans have agreed with you for decades. But if anything, you've seen the situation get worse over time. Why should we believe that it's possible to reform our colleges at all?
So most Americans believe with my views. And why should we believe that they're reformable?
No, why should we believe that universities are redeemable?
Did I say universities are redeemable? That's so unlike me. I'm a pessimist. I wish I could believe they were redeemable. I don't know. It's very hard for me to give up on them. I know there's a lot of people that have just said, like the Peter Thiel thing of don't even go to college, just get a job, be a tech person. It's very hard for me to write them off completely because I believe so much in the humanistic mission. If we do not read John Milton, he dies. It is on us to keep these books alive. We will have failed our ancestors if we do not keep them alive. And the university is the best place to encounter this legacy. There is eros in learning. I fell in love with all of my college professors because they were the source of knowledge. And that dialogue, the teacher-student dialogue, is very powerful. And I wish more students were as inebriated by this as they should be. So turning it around is very difficult. But I'm recently almost coming to the position where you have to walk away and try to create new institutions, but they have the legacy problem. They don't have the status. Let's face it, parents don't give a damn whether their children come out of college having been exposed to the vast, extraordinary kaleidoscope of human achievement. All they want is the bragging rights to say that their kid went to UNC Chapel Hill or Amherst or Middlebury or Duke. And knowledge is a tertiary consideration at best. but it's hard. So it's hard to start a new institution that has that prestige. That's why I like the refounding idea of UPenn so much, because you've got the legacy prestige, but you're starting it out on better principles. That's an ideal thing. So I don't know. I guess I swing back and forth between trying to come up with ways to save it and giving into my innate pessimism, which is that the personnel in universities now are so committed to the victimology narrative that it is going to be very hard to turn it around. So I wish I could be more optimistic. Maybe UNC will give me reason for hope. Thank you for your attention.
Okay.